Welcome back to episode 13 of the Theo Jaffe podcast. Today, I had the pleasure of speaking with Nick Simmons. Nick is a founding partner at Octu Ventures, a venture capital firm investing in teams building on Urbit. Urbit is complicated, and we dive deep into it in this episode, but the essence of it is an attempt to reinvent the entire modern computing stack from scratch, from Urbit OS, a small, cleanly designed operating system, to Urbit ID, a cryptographic ID and networking system whose design predated Bitcoin by nearly a decade. We talk about what exactly Urbit is, what you can do with it, the future of Urbit for personal AI, hardware designed for Urbit, the shaping of Urbit's unique design and aesthetics, and much more. A quick disclaimer, nothing we discuss is investment advice, and Nick, as an Octu partner, may have financial interests in the technologies and companies we discuss. I'm not sponsored by Urbit or Octu in any way. I just think the idea behind Urbit is really cool, and maybe after listening to this episode, you will too. This is the Theo Jaffe podcast. Thank you for listening, and now here's Nick Simmons. Hi, welcome back to episode 13 of the Theo Jaffe podcast. We're here today with Nick Simmons. Nick is a partner at Octu Ventures, which is a venture firm that invests in companies that build on Urbit.
Hey Theo, great to be here.
All right, so first question is, I know, the dreaded question for any kind of Urbit guest is, explain for the audience, for people who may not be as technically minded, what actually is Urbit?
Okay, so the really top level overview here is that you could say that Urbit's a new internet. It's a new way to connect computers and the people that use those computers with applications, platforms, protocols that do all the things that we want computers and the internet to do. So that is sending messages, sharing in social spaces, connecting business, anything like that. Urbit has the potential to build new ways of coordinating human activity, economic activity, social activity, in ways that those of us who work in the project think are probably saner and more stable over the long run. Now, what does that actually mean? To get slightly more technical, Urbit is three key pieces of technology that all unite into this network stack. So there's Urbit OS, which is a completely deterministic functional operating system. So it's a full computational stack. And right now it runs as a virtual machine on top of any Linux environment, but there's no reason you couldn't run it on a chip. And in fact, shout out to Mopful Winrux, who is an Octu member and who is working on a project called NOC FPGA to actually design a chip that implements the core Urbit instruction set, which is called NOC. So that's Urbit OS, and the overall goal of Urbit OS is to allow for a computational stack that's extremely stable. The Urbit core development team is slowly working towards what they call Kelvin 0, which is a totally frozen instruction set. So the core of the computational stack just doesn't change, and for it to be simple. So right now, I mean, the NOC instruction set, which can be broadly analogized to a kernel, fits on a T-shirt. It's dozens of lines of code. The Linux kernel is millions of lines of code. This has really striking and obvious upstream, social and organizational implications, because when you have both extreme complexity and an ever-changing pile of, what programmers call cruft, which are to say overlapping abstractions, patches on patches on patches, to make a computational system run, you basically require a giant bureaucracy to make that run. It's more technical knowledge, and it moves faster than any one person or even small group of people can keep their heads. And so that kind of necessitates a bureaucracy. And computers probably shouldn't require bureaucracy. We're probably past the point of society, or we should be, where that's necessary. And that has all sorts of, implications around, okay, if all of the methods of organizing a bureaucracy start to look, even totalitarian, or they start to look like they impose a high, coordination cost, then there's obvious downsides to that. And so the idea of Urbit OS is that you should be able to run a computer, and that this gets into why people call Urbit a personal server, a computer that could serve up content to other computers, which is say other people, and it should be stable. It should be easy for a layman to run. You should not have to have, say, a certificate in Apache, server maintenance in order to run a server, which is basically the case right now in terms of the servers that major internet platforms run. And it should simply be yours. So the old tagline for Urbit was simple, durable, yours. The second part of the Urbit stack is Urbit ID. So this, fun fact, this is actually the first or second implementation, I believe, of the ERC 721 technical standard, which basically just means NFTs. So these are Ethereum NFTs. And there's three main levels of them, planets, stars, and galaxies. Planets are kind of the individual level Urbit node. Stars are, you could think of them as an ISP or maybe kind of like a community Schelling point node. Schelling point would be just like a coordination point. So, something that a community wants to run. In a very technical sense, what stars do is that they're points for packet routing. So actual, packets of data between any other node in the network, and also peer discovery. So I'll get into this in a minute, but essentially, and then we'll go into galaxies. So galaxies, there's about 4 billion planets, about 165,000 stars, and then 256 galaxies. And galaxies are the root nodes of the network. They're the source of truth for major software updates, and they also form kind of a DAO that makes decisions on whether to upgrade the network or change it in any way. The main example of this is that during DeFi summer, the fees on Ethereum, obviously went way up, and so the cost and fees to boot a new Urbit planet or star became somewhat prohibitive. I think it was about $350 in Ethereum gas fees at one point. And so Tlon, which is the company I used to work for, which is the main company that incubated the Urbit network, they actually devised their own layer 2 rollup to reduce those fees. And so the Galactic Senate had to vote to decide that this was, these new layer 2 identities were going to be valid. And so the way this works in practice is that every planet has a star sponsor. Every star has a galaxy sponsor, and you can leave your, sponsoring entity without permission. You just have to find a new one to adopt you. And so this enables a network architecture that roots around damage, which is to say offline, nodes. So, for example, if your star is not routing packets anymore, it's not online, you simply find a new star. Or if your star decides it doesn't like you anymore, you find a new star, and it doesn't have any say-so over letting you go. You have the right of exit. And so peer discovery in this context is basically that you have to go find someone else's planet for the first time when you want to talk to them. And so the stars handle that decentralized, initial sniffing out, if you will, of where this other person is based on their public key identifier that you have, which is basically their name. So, for example, my Urbit planet name is Simferitwed, and my co-founder in Octu is Kenny, aka SickDev Pilnup. And so, if for the first time I ever, sent Kenny a direct message, a DM on Urbit, my planet sent a packet to my sponsoring star, which then queried a whole bunch of other stars, and it found which one was sponsoring SickDev Pilnup, and it passed on the data, but it also let both of us know where in the whole Urbit network topology our planets were located. So that's the big data dump on how Urbit works. I'm sure you have questions, or I'm sure there's something like clarification on for the audience. So I'll pause.
Yeah. So clarification for the audience would be just like, that was a very good explanation that went into a lot of depth, but just for like a very short, like 20-30 second explanation of what exactly is Urbit and why should I care? Why should an audience member care? What would you say to them about that?
Sure. My explanation would be that there's a whole bunch of decisions that have been made over the entire history of the internet that assume certain things to be true and bake in certain qualities of the internet, and they're not all true anymore. We have a whole bunch of conditions that make them irrelevant now. We can build better network forms of communication and collaboration that aren't dependent on that history and those historical choices. And Urbit is one of the best projects that I found that actually that actually opens up some of those possibilities of coordinating people and capital and social connections in new ways. And we can obviously that needs to be dug into, but fundamentally this is about allowing people better coordination tools to build projects and social graphs that better reflect their actual desires.
So I don't know if you've heard of Roko Mijic.
Sure.
I did not pronounce the last name correctly. But he's someone who's been involved with Urbit for a while. He used to have his Urbit handle Baxel, I believe, on his Twitter profile. And he tweeted pretty recently, Urbit spent 22 years failing to build something there isn't even a market or need for. Think about it. Imagine we wave a magic wand and make Urbit work as intended. People get their own personal serverlets where they can easily host their own content on their own hardware. Meanwhile, in the year of our Lord 2024, Gen Z can't even unglue themselves from TikTok for 5 minutes. You really think they're going to build their own personal website and then also self-host it on their own hardware? And even if they did, would it really make any difference to the world? In 2024, you get away with saying all sorts of naughty things on Twitter thanks to Elon buying it. And as a bonus, it's all easy to use and easy to read because it's a single app, rather than millions of separate websites. Most of the value of the internet is in, and he bolded this part, most of the value of the internet is in the semantic and social network, the connections, the sorting and filtering. And these network hubs are easy for rent-seeking parasites to capture. Urbit can't really solve that because it doesn't have global state. It's distributed, not decentralized. The fundamental innovation came with Bitcoin and later Ethereum, dApps. dApps are much harder for parasites to capture because they can be made trustless, no middleman. So what do you think about those two big critiques? One is that, like, who cares? Like, Gen Z is not going to bother to do all this when they can just, download TikTok in a second and then just spend hours on it. And then critique number two is just that Urbit is distributed, not decentralized, doesn't have global state.
Yeah, so I actually I agree that it's very important to have global state. As the first critique, so this is something that the Octu thesis actually gets into, and if anyone's curious, you can go to Octu.Ventures, mild plug, and read our white paper. And we definitely think that Urbit is a technology on the level of Linux or blockchains in general or TCP/IP, where we're not particularly interested in trying to access, overall, organic adoption into the millions right now, merely because the Urbit meme makes sense to people on a mass scale. We're very focused, and we can talk a bit more about the Octu investment thesis later, but our broad perspective here is that Urbit allows you to build new kinds of businesses, new kinds of products, new kinds of protocols that can capture organic interest and solve problems for people, even just starting on a B2B scale. And so I'm really not concerned about the fact that, yeah, people use TikTok, yeah, people use Twitter, and those are, optimized products right now. They give people what they want. What we're interested in is, where can't you build an optimized product for a use case, whether it's B2B or a social graph or whatever, although we think that the social graph part will come later, where the actual architecture of the internet as it stands just doesn't allow it. So we're very focused on how do you build tools, how do you open up new landscapes, if you will, rather than how do we scale the Urbit meme as previously defined to millions of people. And the second question around global state. So first of all, I think that Urbit, integrates with blockchains very well. The Urbit Foundation has several partnerships that are very interesting there with Near, and I hear some other stuff is on the horizon. And obviously, there have been, Bitcoin and Ethereum OGs that have been very involved in Urbit for a long time. My Octu co-founder, Kenny, was on the founding team at MakerDAO. There's really, once you get inside the Urbit ecosystem, you meet some very, very kind of like early prescient crypto people who all, love Urbit and, work on building stuff inside the ecosystem. So I think that Urbit absolutely does need to be able to call out to sources of global state, global consensus. And I'm personally I'm personally very bullish on Urbit ID and reputation, as anyone who's met me in an Urbit context can attest, no pun intended, because I think that we're actually very competitive and very far ahead of most of the existing alternative, digital or self-sovereign ID projects or reputation projects. And the fact that Urbit is a deterministic VM and has this network to talk between nodes actually accentuates this quite a bit. And it's also worth mentioning, by the way, that most of the projects that we have either funded at Octu so far or that we see on the horizon are starting to all resemble each other in the sense of probably producing a bunch of interaction data between their users, and then being able to use that as a pretty high signal way to mutually signal reputation via those interactions in a way that can probably be globally useful. And so I think there are ways to make internal global state, and then write it to a blockchain, write it to a global consensus layer to verify it. But one interesting thing about blockchains and Urbit is that blockchains, for the most part, at least with any application that we've seen so far, have a pretty limited repertoire of things that you do on them, and therefore opportunities to create, reputation, identity, really granular, proof of human, if you will, in the new context. Certainly there are dApps, but dApp usage is pretty bad for the most part, and anything outside of purely financialized transactions. Blockchain social in general is pretty much a flop. Blockchain-based interactions, certainly things that have to write to chain, usually hit this dilemma of either, adoption creates fees, or you simply never get adoption in the first place because there's too high of a barrier. Certainly L2s and things like Solana are interesting, although, now Solana has its own uptime issues, and obviously there's a very valid critique based on, over-centralization there. So I think that, I would agree that Urbit needs to be a computing and identity and coordination layer that talks to global consensus layers, aka blockchains, L1s, what have you. But I see that more as something where there's a lot of mutual benefit, and everyone I talk to pretty much agrees in Urbit ecosystem, rather than some failing of Urbit as a complete stack that it won't get there.
So going back to what you said earlier about Urbit ID and why you're bullish on it, and it's ahead of a lot of other kind of digital cryptographic identity projects. What do you think about Worldcoin, Sam Altman's Worldcoin?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring up Worldcoin, because I did a deep dive on the digital ID space a couple years ago, and I actually I went to the IIW, which is the Internet Identity Workshop, which is the main conference every year for this field, and this is I think 2022, and Worldcoin was there. They did a demo, saw the orb. Worldcoin is interesting because they are simultaneously, I think, a little bit ahead of the curve on one of the main failure modes, but then encapsulate one of the other giant failure modes that I see here. So to explain this, Worldcoin actually, I think, is a little bit smarter than people give them credit for, in the sense that they do have some pretty sophisticated thinking around how do you, hash the original biometric data and use that in a way to prove personhood, basically. And I think that some of the critiques there are kind of superficial. However, the real problem that I see with Worldcoin, for the application that I'm talking about, to be clear, I mean, Sam Altman's stated rationale for Worldcoin is to provide this basis for UBI. I can't even really comment on that. I don't have a firm opinion on that, because it's so far away from what I'm trying to do with digital ID. But when you look at the history of really most tech paradigms and how they arise and how they get network effect, it's not by, say, going to the third world and getting a whole bunch of people to scan their eyeballs and then bootstrapping from a whole bunch of people that don't have capital and don't have access to kind of elite technological social circles. It's the opposite. Urbit, so far, even though a lot of the tooling hasn't been built to make ID and reputation work in a really granular way, already has the opposite. I mean, if you have any contact with the Urbit community, you understand that this is a very, very special, high value, high trust community of very prescient and capable people with all sorts of interesting connections. And so the way that I think about digital ID usually comes into two failure modes. The first is when you have a good design, but you don't pair it with any kind of use case that actually gets you organic adoption among people whose actions constitute high value, high signal in network reputation data. So again, Worldcoin I think is doing a good job of designing some aspects of this. They really have found an interesting way at least to prove personhood, but they're not deploying it among people in San Francisco who are going to use it as a real use case and really bound that use case so that it has little takeoff network effects in the same way that, say, I don't know, like the Homebrew Computer Club started in a garage in Cupertino, and a whole bunch of those guys did very interesting stuff. And if you were there, you were part of the scene. It's true for music scenes. I actually used to work in the music industry. It's really true for anything. And blockchains or digital ID is just a way to codify it. The other kind of inverse failure mode is that you have really good, early network effects. You have a scene, but you don't legibilize it in a way that actually allows people to, to kind of prove it or attest it. So this could just mean that it's illegible, and lots of things are illegible, and that's fine. Or it can mean that you're just not, that you think you're representing reality, you think you're representing these interactions, and you're not representing kind of what makes them valuable, or you're not proving this is actually someone's key, central way that they actually signify what they're up to. And so, for example, I think there have been some digital ID protocols that I think got decent uptake among kind of crypto savvy people, but it didn't give them the opportunity or didn't give them the incentives to actually use this for the majority of their online or even crypto based activity. And so the defection risk there and the fact that it's just not capturing their activity in a way that really telegraphs commitment to that ID paradigm, that reputation paradigm, means that it's ultimately destined to fail because the defect rate and the flake rate is too high.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the future of Urbit and different directions it can go. So do you think that Urbit needs a kind of growth model to survive, or could it survive indefinitely as kind of like a niche product?
Well, that's an interesting question. So, I mean, I pretty firmly believe that Urbit, first of all, Urbit's growing. If you look at, nodes on network, if you look at developer growth, and especially, I think if you look at capital coming into the ecosystem this year, the growth of new startups and the technical maturity of core parts of the stack, I especially want to call out the AIMS upgrades, so the networking upgrades that allow for a lot, lower latency, and a lot more simultaneous connections between Urbit nodes. And then the other big thing this year is NewMars, which is an updated runtime, and so much actual, faster computation and larger loom size, so much larger memory. The joke inside, Urbit circles is that you want to be able to host the AVI file of Shrek 2 inside your Urbit and play Shrek 2. And now there's also a great Twitter thread the other day from Ted Blackman, Robinus Rickfer, who's the CTO of the Urbit Foundation, around some of the Loom expansion and runtime improvements that could actually allow some early, machine learning activity inside the Urbit runtime, which is wild. Definitely not something that I think people really saw coming a couple years ago when it was extremely limited. And so, building on those technical improvements, I definitely see that there's a lot of growth coming. At the same time, I think that obviously it would be unfortunate if for whatever reason I don't know, we entered into the mother of all winters for capital and attention and usage and so forth. I think that's true of any protocol. However, Urbit exists. Like the PKI exists. The address space is remarkably well distributed. You go to Urbit conferences, you kind of sniff around, and I mean, you can also just look on chain, like how many unique wallet owners for stars and planets and galaxies. And I think this is particularly meaningful at the galaxy level, is that a remarkable array of people are committed to this project and have and have significant interest in it, financial and just attentional and technical. And so the protocol is already out there. It has it has application to reality. It has use cases. It has people building on it. I love the Bitcoin meme of Honey Badger don't care. Oh, there's a downturn. Oh, Jim Cramer comes on CNBC and talks shit about you. Like, who cares? Like, keep building. Like, so yeah, there's always going to be upticks and downticks. I really think this is something where I'm fascinated by the idea of building just indestructible primitives, indestructible networks. And we can get into this later, but like, I am personally fascinated by the idea of making these networks as unkillable as possible and really kind of crazy extrapolations that leads to. Can we put an Urbit, node on a CubeSat? Can we inscribe the actual, binary notation of an Urbit, virtual machine on rocks in the desert? Like, these are fun thought experiments, but I think they actually lead somewhere productive in the sense of there really are, unlike, say, a lot of legacy systems where the ownership in the social graph is illegible and just kind of like dictated by fiat, or it's on paper somewhere, or, there's some actually the degradation of digital information is way, way, way more advanced than people understand. I mean, a huge amount of the content that has been produced on the internet, in fact, does not live anywhere. It's actually been lost. It's actually been wiped. So yeah, I think that like there's, with the advent of things like Urbit and blockchains that have distributed ownership, distributed consensus, and also are, writing information to a distributed state layer, it really is a different paradigm in terms of what it means for something to be growing, active, or defunct. Like, I think we're already, have you heard of this? Have you heard of this kind of, crackpot hypothesis about whether, we could tell if there was an industrial civilization in the fossil record millions of years ago?
That sounds vaguely familiar.
So, I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment. I don't think that there's evidence that we had a fossil fuel civilization, millions of years ago. But then the question among, geologists and so forth is, okay, would it have left enough evidence? And I think there's a loose corollary you could make to something like Urbit, which is how big of a civilizational catastrophe would it take to wipe out the evidence, or even kind of like enough of a subset of Urbit IDs, or let's say, something the Bitcoin blockchain, anything like that, to the point where if there was interest and if there was, a compelling need for it, that you could bootstrap it back up again. Theory, from a game theoretic level, all you would really need is a handful of galaxy IDs that say, okay, this is still the network, and we're going to reconstitute it, and we're going to vote to spawn perhaps more galaxies, more stars, if a whole bunch of keys have been lost. And this sounds just kind of like science fictional speculation, but again, I really think that this is an important factor in what's the difference in what we're building now for the long term versus things that don't have these provable interactions on the identity layer and on the kind of like social contract layer.
So going back to what you said earlier about Urbit growing, Urbit stars were selling in 2021. They were selling for like $28,000 on average on Uniswap and OpenSea, and now they're more like $1,000, and they haven't really recovered, even as the broader market for cryptographic assets has recovered like significantly. Bitcoin's gone from like 20,000 back to like 70. It's hit a new all-time high since 2021. So why hasn't Urbit address space recovered too?
I don't try to speculate too much on price. I think that where so many things in the crypto ecosystem in general are very meme driven. But I will say this, that I think that there's a general tendency, and Urbit is by far, not the only project where you see this, where tokens or NFTs or something, bespoke like Urban Address Space as some sort of digital land, becomes a meme coin for the general idea in the absence of other ways to gain exposure. And so, purely from a personal perspective here, my suspicion is that the level of interest in Urbit, as far as I can see, and I've been well placed to observe this, keeps going up. And so it's a very valid question to ask, okay, why hasn't the star price, kept pace? And I think the answer, honestly, is that now there are more ways to essentially invest in the ecosystem rather than simply buying a star on OpenSea. And so, for example, Octu does not invest in Urban Address Space. We all have a lot of Urban Address Space. We're all generally, bullish on its value going up. I do think that there's going to need to be some technical work and some kind of like product and ideation work around how do you make address space specifically, because the interesting thing is, okay, it's a non-fungible token, right? But really, if you just buy a random star on OpenSea that's never been booted, that's never interacted with anybody, sure, maybe you like the sigil, and I mean, the sigils are great, the names are great, but other than that, it is still pretty fungible. And this is even true to the point where for a while there was a project called Rapstar that to make it even more fungible. And so I think that there does need to be some work done on building things that imbue given chunks of the address space with value, maybe as subnets, maybe as something that accrues reputation, maybe as web of trust that mutually reinforces reputation on the group level or the subnet level. But as to the price again, I really just think that what happened is that all of a sudden, I mean, when I joined the project, there were two Urbit companies. Both of them mostly sold address space. Then there was a little bit of hosting company. Yep. And now there's a lot of startups. There's a lot of technical projects where you can put your time and energy. There's a lot of grants from the Urbit Foundation to work on stuff. And then now there's actually two projects in the works. There's a Send Chain from Tiller Tolbus at Chorus One, and then there's another Urbit L1 project from Sunny Agarwal at Cosmos. It's mostly being worked on by Laconic. And both of these aim to not only give some global consensus layer to Urbit as an Urbit-native L1 blockchain, but also have some interesting ideas around how the reputation layer and the economic layer could work in ways that incorporate address space. So I would definitely encourage everyone to keep an eye on those things. I think both of them are kind of like in the publishing early communiques stage, but I don't ultimately see undifferentiated address space stars basically as being really, I think, ever again so much the concentrated bet or meme coin on the overall health of the ecosystem, at least not for a very long time. And where I'm choosing to put my efforts in Octu is investing in early stage startups that build things on Urbit. And that's where my kind of very opinionated thesis is.
Do you think there is any kind of proper intrinsic value of an Urbit star? Like, can you go about valuing Urbit address space, or is it more like Bitcoin where there's no real way to value it because there's no cash flow? It's just a purely cryptographic asset.
Well, I think that both of these things have something in common, which is scarcity, and that ultimately you start to get increasing value within a scarce namespace or a scarce currency store of value space in the case of Bitcoin. When you have a whole bunch of people who reach a social consensus on what the value of that scarcity is to them in terms of preventing various kinds of downside risks. In Bitcoin's case, it's, hey, we're worried about money printing. Like, there's no actual limit to the amount of fiat money that a government or a central bank can print. So we're all going to subscribe to the, social illusion. And I don't say that in a negative way, that, hey, it's valuable that there's only ever, 21 million Bitcoins. And so this Bitcoin that I own has a value as a percentage of that. Similarly, with Urbit, I think that if Urbit got to the point of adoption that Bitcoin had, of course you'd see address space go up. Not financial advice, but like that really seems to stand to reason. because you have a whole bunch of people agreeing that the scarcity aspect, as it represents, trust and distribution of the network and so forth, also benefits from that scarcity, and they want a piece of that. Now, what happens before that, I think, is very interesting. And that's why I say that like subnets and like biting off chunks of this scarcity and maybe either imbuing them with some sort of, economic function, or simply saying, okay, this corner of the network, this, thousands or millions of planets are attested to in a given way, and we're going to carve out this chunk and use it for a given use case. And within that, there's even a greater degree of scarcity. And it's very interesting to think about the network growing with multiple examples of that then have to have some sort of foreign policy with each other or some sort of equivalency. And it's almost like, the original metaphor of Urbit as land is very apropos here. When you're on a frontier, or you're even, I guess, settling a different planet, land is cheap, and so people have the ability to go homestead in different parts of it and build their own thing and define it their own way, and and then over time the borders creep to each other, and they have to figure out how they're going to relate to each other, and then the value of land maybe in between goes up. And I think that that's the process that we are going to have to watch and see with address space. But it also informs, again, that I don't see the value in just owning huge swaths of undifferentiated address space and waiting for it to accrue value in the near term. It's much more around, what are the cities you're going to build, how are you going to bring people there, and what are the industries you're going to build there.
Can you go into a little more detail about like the intention behind the original land metaphor? Because I think that was probably one of Curtis Yarvin's best pieces on Urbit.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I can't speak for Curtis. He's certainly a prolific podcast guest. I encourage you to get in contact, and I know he doesn't often speak about Urbit design stuff. Although yeah, very good, very good. So I won't presume to speak for Curtis, but as somebody who has watched the growth of the network, I do think that it was a very good design decision on his part to make it so large, even though it leads to this current, price drop that you see while people kind of, acclimatize to the homesteading phase. This really is, Urbit really is a new world. And this is almost a little cliche to say at this point, but I really believe it. And giving people huge swaths of node IDs, whether for humans or for infrastructural points or whatever, is really, really important when you have the ambition to replace the entire, up to the minute paradigm of networked computing. And by the way, a little bit of a side note here, something that people don't talk about a lot is that below the planet, star, galaxy paradigm we've talked about before are something called moons. So moons are derivative identities. They do have their own keys, but they are permanently tied to a planet owner. And the design space for moons has always been a little bit underspecified, but I'm very interested in ways that moons can not only provide IoT device identifiers, which is actually an underexplored direction in IoT in general in terms of verifying where your data came from, certainly in a deterministic way. Datnut Pollen read a great piece on this back when we were both at Tlon, called Lunar IoT and the Internet, or something like Lunar IoT and the Internet of Things, something like that. But I'm also very interested in something that I call node dispersal, which is that blockchains and protocols like Urbit, so far, if you look at where nodes are being hosted, it's going to be a preponderance of, depending on the technical, requirements, you're going to see an awful lot of, validator nodes for various blockchains in AWS buckets. And then even if it's actually, self-hosted, where's it going to cluster? It's going to be San Francisco, Seattle, Berlin, Lisbon, New York. And that seems like a thing that we need to scale past. Like that's an overconcentration of, these supposedly decentralized networks. An interesting way to view the whole proof of work versus proof of stake, debate or argument is that, and this is one lens to look at it from. This is definitely not the only one, but I find it instructive sometimes. Is that proof of work fundamentally is a bet that the distribution of cheap or free energy and the ability to exploit it as it's distributed over the Earth's surface is, and obviously modulo people knowing about something like Bitcoin, or something like, I guess, or Dogecoin, or, pre-merge Ethereum, and, knowing that you can do this, that this is a thing you can do. But with Bitcoin in particular, you know, the Bitcoin mining has penetrated deep into, say, provincial China. It's penetrated deep into the provincial U.S. Deep upstate New York, for example, all over the world. I mean, and then it has technical innovations like, flared natural gas on an like an off-grid drill site. You go and you mine Bitcoin with it, and it's not economical to export the energy in terms of a gas pipeline. It is economical to export the hashed mathematical results of Bitcoin mining, over a packet radio. And so, but then proof of stake is basically a bet much more on, okay, this blockchain is going to scale via people who have the cultural imprimatur and the social connection to the people who started, who tend to be educated Western technical types. I don't think either of these has a monopoly on insight, but I think it's an interesting dichotomy between how resources are distributed and to the extent that blockchains are supposed to be this very durable layer of distributing information, access, and economic rails across the physical space, how they're distributed. And so in that context, I think that moons are super interesting in terms of how can we achieve physical decentralization via node dispersal across every possible boundary with the Urbit network. Can we put moons as Urbit nodes on devices? Can we optimize for geographical decentralization? Can we put them in outer space? Can we put them across political boundaries? And two, follow-up questions here: how can we measure this in the most kind of like robust way to actually provide a score, if you will, of like how decentralized the network is? And two, what do you do with them? And what's the practical upshot? So one super interesting thing about Urbit, right? It's a network of personal servers, and you run a client locally, and you can dial into APIs, blockchain sources of data, et cetera, et cetera. I assume you've heard about this Wells notice that Uniswap just got.
The what? The Uniswap just got?
So Uniswap just got something called a Wells notice from the SEC, and we don't know the contents yet, or at least we didn't of last night. And a Wells notice basically serves as intent that the SEC is going to bring legal action against you. So basically the story here is that, and this actually goes back to one of Roko's critiques, is that dApps are solving for supposedly things that Urbit was trying to solve a while ago. Well, one thing that dApps have not solved, and that they are getting in trouble for right now, is that the actual front-end server layer is the vulnerability. And so this is most obviously true for DeFi right now, but it's also probably going to be true for certain kinds of, AI to consumer apps, in terms of you're dialing in to use a model, where does that model live, but also where are you and how are you accessing it. So Urbit excels this. And actually there's been quite a bit of interest from DeFi protocols in, hey, how do you use Urbit to serve up the front end so that someone can use a dApp, can use, an AMM, an automated market maker. How do you actually interact with the blockchain, rather, in an actually decentralized way for the user? And so one idea around making Urbit node dispersal extremely robust is that this allows you to have, umpteenth degree redundancies for mirroring sources of data, mirroring front ends, and actually like keeping being a backup for any kind of global state coordination protocol, blockchains or otherwise. There are other options there too, as well as representing reality. So things like POAPs, proof of attendance protocol, proof of location protocol, um, you know, things like helium, packet radio, etc. Very interested in how we can make Urbit and networks like it actually span the earth and start to instantiate. I mean, the original metaphor, right, is Borges. It's Tlon Uqbar Orbis Tertius, and the story, of course, is about a map that is the same size as the territory that it describes. And you know, Curtis knew what he was talking about when when using that metaphor. And I'm very interested in ways to make that real.
So, changing topics a bit, let's talk about AI and the future of AI on Urbit. Because I think that, the perfect application for, having a decentralized personal server would be to run a decentralized personal AI on, especially because it seems like actually good personal AI is imminent. You know, who knows what Apple is about to announce with Siri in a couple of months, and then OpenAI is coming out with GPT-5 soon after that, most likely. Sometime by the end of the year, we'll have very good LLMs, and people are already building out the infrastructure. So, what do you think is the future of AI on Urbit, both implementation and then what people will actually be able to do with it?
Yeah, so this is super interesting. There's a whole bunch of different threads we could pull. So obviously, I think that you know, access to protocolized AI compute and model access, and also honestly markets for data sets that you would feed to a model on large and small scales. I think Urbit helps with the protocolization of that quite a bit, and I really don't know anything else that applies nearly as much there. But there's also very interesting things to say about what you can do with all the interaction data that you create. So each Urbit virtual machine that you or I run is an event log. It's just literally a list of computational events that you've performed with your machine, and it lives locally, and it doesn't have global state by default, but certainly you could create a protocol to write this out to a blockchain whenever you want. And there's actually been some interesting early experiments in kind of like peer-to-peer local consensus like agreements on that Urbit computational level between Urbits. This is something called Agora that Quartus and the Dalton Collective experimented with a couple of years back. And so because you have this deterministic event log of everything you've done, and that includes, of course, the connections you've made with other Urbits and data you've gotten from other Urbits over from the network, it's very interesting to think about training a personal model on your activity as a kind of proof human, and then zero knowledge hashing that and using that as your badge of identity in a very kind of up to the minute way. And again, as we were talking about, some of the pitfalls of digital ID protocols, I think that proof of human is going to become an arms race, and that if you don't have the primacy of someone's everyday, online behavior to draw reputation data from in order to kind of like model them as a human, then you're going to fall behind pretty quickly. At the same time, you are definitely going to need to ZKify this to not simply leak everyone's data or even just kind of behavior patterns, if naively obscured, in ways that leave them vulnerable. And so it's very interesting to think about personal models deployed to prove who you are, to prove belonging, but also to act on your behalf and learn from your behavior. And it does seem like Urbit is the kind of thing that would provide a moat there for you to run a personal model in, interact with data set marketplaces, and then command a fleet of virtual assistants on your behalf, which I mean, the Moon identity seems to align well with that. But ultimately, I think that my top level thoughts about Urbit and AI is that AI is probably going to cause a massive it's probably going to cause a massive collapse in the social context and the legacy, reputation, identity, meaning systems that we currently live under. I mean, they were already straining pretty badly. And this is a key part of the Octu thesis, is that we think that Urbit has massive potential to build what we call digital civil infrastructure, which is to say, to encapsulate the values that its users and builders actually want. Digital Jeffersonianism is one way to put this, of allowing people to actually have a defensible moat around their family, their community, their business, their data, and to say, hey, I'm gonna interact in marketplace, I'm gonna interact in society, but there's a line past which, cannot be trespassed. And honestly, I think that AI is going to make this, necessary sooner rather than later. And it's extremely, extremely important that we encode the values that we want into a defensible digital substrate before that happens, because there's really no guarantee that that they will simply be uptaken, uh, whether it's by megacorps that use AI or not, or whether it's simply by these models in the sense that they're eating all the data from the internet in the past 30 or 40 years of written content.
And then not just AI, but the rest of the future of Urbit. For example, what could like an Urbit hardware ecosystem look like? Whether it be CPUs, I know you talked about this, knock
Mm-hmm.
FPGA earlier, or like actual full blown like computer hardware, like consumer desktop or laptop hardware. And what about Urbit on mobile? Like, what could that look like? Would it be more of an app on existing OSs, or would it be its own mobile OS or its own mobile device? So, yeah, what's the future of the kind of actual like hardware layer of Urbit? How will people
So
interact?
yeah. So first of all, this is already very much a thing. So the obvious shout out here is to Native Planet, which is a great company in Austin, Texas, that builds Urbit hosting hardware. So with a bunch of very very clever, very cool software integrations to make it easy to run your own planet or star on a custom built hardware box. And they have several models. Highly recommend checking them out. NativePlanet.io. Um, and so yeah, so there's already hardware that's purpose built to run your Urbit nodes locally, to run your Urbit VM locally. Um, I think there's massive potential here. Some of the areas I've already mentioned in terms of node dispersal. I think that Urbit, optimized sensors, space hardware, things like that. And I think there could be very interesting kind of, flywheels and mutually complementary economies here, where the the economic mandate of node dispersal and provable real geographical decentralization can reduce the costs for the ancillary business use cases of, hey, we want sensors here to track X, Y, and Z, or to provide relays for other networks, or like packet radio, mesh nets, that kind of thing. So I'm very interested in Urbit sensors, very interested in Urbit hardware that creates real geographical decentralization. In terms of Urbit apps, I mean, there's some, Tlon has an iPhone app, which works quite well, and highly recommend everyone check that out. That's really made it much easier to kind of use Urbit on the go. Um, if you're asking, is there going to be an Urbit phone, like the Solana, Saga phone? That's certainly an interesting question. I see a lot more hardware interest from Urbiters than I did a year ago, and so I think that people are kind of, trying to wrap their heads around this stuff. One aspect that I think may be accelerating this a little bit is that Apple recently breached what was previously considered to be quite a bright line in taking a hard line against PWAs, progressive web apps, which were basically a bit of an end run around some of the, frankly, pretty absurd strictures on what can and can't get accepted in the App Store. Um, the whole question of whether an entrant to the smartphone business that can get around some of the Apple and Android quasi monopolies for apps, especially around crypto integrations, is certainly super interesting. And I kind of suspect that it's pressure building behind a dam, and that we will get there maybe even sooner than we think. At the same time, geopolitics and the geopolitics of chip production and sophisticated electronic production in general are a big question mark, especially with all the stuff around Taiwan right now. So that could throw a wrench in all that stuff. I really want to see good thinking, and I want to see, honestly, pitches here around how you unite the Urbit vision with hardware, real use cases, and that geographical and technological kind of like hosting environment, decentralization, and dispersal factor.
So we've only got a few minutes left, so I want to go into a little bit some of the like design decisions behind Urbit. So,
Sure.
for example, where did the syllable-based naming conventions come from? I've noticed like recently a lot of passwords are now very similar to like Urbit syllables, where you have like a bunch of normal sounding syllables or English words separated by hyphens. So which came first?
You mean passwords outside of Urbit?
Yes.
I think that has to be convergent evolution. I think I've noticed a little bit of what you're talking about recently. I mean, the whole topic of like of password optimization to get around dictionary, what they used to call a dictionary attack, has been going on for a very long time. And of course, now everyone just uses the suggested password that password managers, browsers, and so forth run. So I couldn't really tell you if there's any. I mean, I really highly doubt there's a connection there. I don't know the full story of exactly why the Urbit, I mean, the syllables are meant to be, human memorable because it's easier than memorizing, a bunch of dotted quads, right? And obviously there is a correspondence between the Urbit syllable names and the sigils. There's a great post by I believe by Gavin, who created the sigils, called appropriately Creating Sigils. If you go way back in the Urbit.org blog, that's worthy of reading. And yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan. I don't know the full history, but I'm a big fan of how that works because they really are memorable. And my I remember at one point, maybe a year or two after I originally joined Talon, I realized that I probably knew upwards of 100 people, like so easily, like over a Dunbar number of people by their Urbit names, their Urbit planet names, rather than in most cases their real names.
That's pretty cool. And then what about the influence of Christopher Alexander? I know there's another article about that. I'm actually reading the pattern a pattern language right now, and I didn't even know. I've known about Urbit for like years. I had no idea that Urbit was inspired by Christopher Alexander.
Yeah, I'm not a Christopher Alexander expert, so I would recommend talking to Galen, or possibly to some of the the OG design team at Talon. Ed Fabled Faster has some great thoughts on Christopher Alexander, and really the whole design genesis of Urbit and Talon's products is fascinating. I will say that like one of the things that really attracted me to Urbit in the first place was a sense of really like that it was important to know and understand the whole teleological history of technology and product design. And it's actually funny. I was just on another podcast from Octu Ventures that will be coming out next week, and at the very end we talked a little bit about hey, what would you be doing if you weren't working in crypto or tech? And my answer, which has always been true, is that I'd probably be a historian. And I've always been super, super interested in tech history. I have a little bit of a family connection. My grandfather worked in the ENIAC in the 40s, and so I grew up, using like little punch cards as scratch paper, and I kind of thought that was normal as a little kid. Like, didn't everyone's grandpa work on computers, right? Yeah, it's in the I'm assuming you went to the Computer History Museum.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, no, one of my favorite places. I could spend hours in there. I've been there
And this
many,
went
many
on for
times.
longer. It ended in
What's
like 1995, 2000.
I know, right? I
It went
know.
for about 25
Uh,
years.
yep, yep. I mean, that's when it was started. I think the museum, and so they have a backwards looking perspective there, maybe. But yeah, so I've always been super interested in how this stuff developed, and one of the things that really made clear to me about Urbit is that like there have been a whole bunch of junctures in the history of computing, the history of network computing, and the history of mass onboarding of people into these network computing platforms, where particular decisions were made. They were usually contingent on what came before and what the current ground conditions were at the time, and some of them worked out really, really well for, I'd say, the average person and the ability of developers and entrepreneurs to build what they wanted. Like, we're definitely living in something that is far from the worst possible world here. Are we living in the best world? No, of course not. Hence why I work in this stuff. Hence why we all work in this stuff. But the thing that really impressed upon me was that there were times when for example, early on, I think Bill Gates and some others in the early 90s wanted to essentially encircle the internet, encircle some of these protocols. And instead, we got TCP/IP, which is an open protocol. We got SMTP for email, which is an open protocol. Although honestly, the dominance of Gmail as the as the front end to that is eroding that a bit. There was some pretty scary censorship going on with GDocs, at least.
Scary. Shout out to my last guest.
Oh, really? And so I do think that it's very important to consider, okay, if you're at one of these junctures and you're in a position to build something or fund something that can, make the right decision and return agency and return, network effects and coordination ability to the users, to the developers, to the entrepreneurs whose heart is in the right place, you should do that. And that's the highest calling you could possibly have as a technologist. And I really think that the degree to which the Urbit ecosystem and everyone I've met in it considers these questions and knows the history and knows, hey, it's important to build this stuff right, is one of the things that grabbed me in the first place and still like gets me out of bed in the morning.
Well, I think that's an excellent place to wrap it up. My answer to what would I want to do as a career if I wasn't interested in tech is similar. I would probably want to be an architect. Also, Christopher Alexander inspired. So yeah, I'm thrilled to see that he's had an influence on Urbit too. Well, thank you so much, Nick, for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed this episode.
Absolutely. I enjoyed it too. You asked great questions. And if anyone wants to follow up and continue the conversation, you can drop my Twitter handle in the show notes. And as mentioned, my main project right now is being a founding member and partner at Octu Ventures, which is a member-driven venture DAO that invests in seed stage Urbit projects. And we have some writing on our website, octu.ventures. And I really try to, make that the vessel for most of my energy into Urbit these days. And I'd love for people to check that out.
All right. Well, links to everything will be in the description. So thanks again.
Awesome. Thanks, Theo.
Talk to you later.
Thanks for listening to this episode with Nick Simmons. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the Theo Jaffe podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Follow me on Twitter at Theo Jaffe and subscribe to my Substack at theojaffe.com. Also be sure to check out Nick's Twitter, Halikarnian, at HALIKAARN1AN, and check out Octu at octu.ventures and Urbit at urbit.org. All of these, plus a lot more, will be linked in the description. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next episode.